For today's cup of coffee, I'm rolling along today. Youngest kid is not feeling well, so he's getting the day off, and I have Hilo as co-host today. Can you say hello, Hilo? Oh, he's purring. So anyhow, what we're going to be discussing today comes from a website that is called Real British Isles, or Real British Ghost, my bad, comes from the Real British Isles. And these are the legends of the Screaming Skulls. Now, there was a black and white movie at one point that was called The Screaming Skull, and I'm sure that it took a lot of, inspiration from this. So there's actually more than one. All right, guys, over there in England and stuff, what are y'all doing with all these screaming skulls? It seems to be peculiar to Britain, and I would definitely give credit to whomever the writer is, but we'll include the website in the description box. So if I don't have a name, I can't give credit. It says that the stories regarding the origin of the skulls vary, but the problems that follow when the haunted skull is moved have much in common. This can include bad luck, poltergeist activity, and blood-curdling screams. And at least one of the skulls has been professionally examined, and it's been found to be considerably older than the legend suggests. And one of the screaming skulls is at Bettiscombe Manor, and that is in Bridgeport, Dorset. Now, this place is not open to the public, and according to the story, there was a certain individual named Azariah Penny, and this individual was banished to the West Indies in 1685 for some activity connected with the English Civil War. And he managed to make his way back to England, but when he did, he brought an African slave with him. And the dying wish of the slave was that his body be returned to his native land. And that was never done, and he was buried in a local churchyard. It says immediately after his burial, groans and other terrifying noises were heard coming from the grave, and Azariah was forced to remove the corpse from the grave. So that's always fun, having to dig somebody up. He said he stored it for a time in the attic. That must have been fun too. And over time, the body crumpled until all that remained was the skull. Many attempts have been made to remove the skull, and it had even been thrown into a pond. But each time it had returned to the house on account of the screams and groans that were heard in the house. And then in 1963, the screaming skull was examined by a pathologist. And it turns out that the skull was actually between 3,000 and 4,000 years old and was from a European woman. So I don't know exactly where that legend got started, but yeah. And some think that it could have actually come from the Iron Age and a ritual site at Pilston Pen, which was situated near the manor house. And there's another one at Burton Agnes, and this is in East Yorkshire. And Burton Agnes Hall was built during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I by three sisters, the daughters of Sir Henry Griffiths. Unfortunately, it was before it could be completed, one of the sisters, Anne, was attacked, and she was stabbed and fatally wounded. It'd been nice if they had said who stabbed and, fatally wounded her. Before she died, she made her sisters promise that her head would be removed from her body and always kept in the hall. Not surprisingly, this was not done. Now, that's a lot to ask of a family member. After the newly built hall was completed, it was plagued with strange moaning and weird sounds until the poor sisters could bear it no longer. When they visited the family vault in order to carry out their sister's deathbed request, they discovered that her head was now just a skull, and conveniently it was separated from the rest of the torso. So the skull was then taken to the hall and peace had returned. However, a servant, not believing the story, threw the skull onto a passing wagon, whereupon the horses reared in fear, the hall trembled, and pictures fell off the walls. So the screaming skull was replaced in the hall, eventually the skull was bricked up in the wall somewhere within the house for safety. Now, I don't know why this servant decided to take it upon herself. So, anyhow, don't be throwing nobody else's skulls, folks. There was one from Calgith Hall. It's these British terms. They always screw me up. And this is in a place called Cumbria, and it's not open to the public either. And it says a justice of the peace by the name of Miles Phillipson, who owned Cargith Hall in Cumbria, wanted the land which was owned by a local couple to add to his already vast estate. However, they refused to sell. Determined to get the land by whatever means necessary, he invited them to a meal on Christmas Day, saying that he was no longer interested in their land and wanted to show them that there was no hard feelings. And while they were enjoying their meal, a silver cup was hidden on them. It must have been a small cup, that or maybe they had belongings or some kind of something that they were carrying. Anyhow, the silver cup was hidden in their possessions. Then the next day, soldiers arrived at their farm and demanded to search their home. And of course, the cup was found and they were arrested. There was a trial, but Phillipson was the judge in the case. And the outcome, of course, was very much rigged. And the couple that were then found guilty were sentenced to hang. And on the scaffold, the woman uttered a terrible curse on the Phillipson family. And she had said that, that there would never be any more prosperity there. And as far as them having the inability to have kids and stuff after it. And it says, while Cargith's strong woes shall stand, we'll haunt it day and night. So, shortly after the couple's death, 2 skulls mysteriously appeared at the hall, and every night terrible screams were heard. Many attempts were made to dispose of the skulls, but whatever method was used, the skulls always found their way back to the hall. Phillipson himself never prospered. He lost all his money, and his health failed. And then after his death, the hall passed from the ownership of his family, and everything became quiet. And the screaming skulls were eventually bricked up somewhere in the hall, where they remain to this day. So I guess some of these older places don't be poking around in them. Another one was from Higher Chilton Farm, and this is in Somerset. It's also not open to the public. During the English Civil War, this gentleman named Theophilus Brougham, who will from here on be known as Brougham, had originally been a staunch royalist. However, so appalled did he become at the way in which the king's troops treated their prisoners that he defected to be one of the Roundheads. That's interesting. I know a lot of people around here that are Roundheads. After the war ended and King Charles II was restored to the throne, Brougham lived quietly at High Farm with his sister, but he feared upon his death his head would be disinterred and put on public display as a traitor to the king. Who does that? I mean, really? Well, I guess it's from a people that put heads on pig poles. Yeah. And thus it was that he made his sister promise that his skull would be preserved in the house for all time. And this promise the sister made every attempt to fulfill. When he died, his head was removed from his body and kept in the house. Eventually, the sister died, and the farm had a number of tenants. Several attempts were made to dispose of the cranium, but whenever this was done, the most frightful screams were heard in the house, accompanied by poltergeist activity. And so the screaming skull now sits in a special cabinet over a door in the hall. That's actually pretty cool. Braham's tomb can be seen in St. James Church, and although there is no mention made in the tomb's inscription, there is some circumstantial evidence that suggests that there was some truth to the Screaming Skull legend. And during restoration work on the church, the tomb was opened, and the skull indeed was found to be missing. That's pretty awesome. From Tunstead Farm in Derbyshire. This is also not open to the public. There are 2 stories as to the origin of this screaming skull, which is known to its friends as Dickie. The first is that it belonged to a man who was murdered by his cousin at Tunstead Farm in the room where the skull is now kept. The murdered man was called Ned Dixon, hence the nickname Dickie. And then the second story is that it belonged to an unnamed woman who was murdered at the farm and who, with her dying breath, requested that her mortal remains not be buried, but they be kept at the farm. Over the years, the rest of her body had been lost, so all that remained was the skull. And they said that this might be more of a reasonable story. That's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because that Tunstead Farm is also haunted by a woman who is looked upon by occupants as a sort of guardian. And there are the traditional stories about attempts having been made to dispose of the object. And it's said that each time, even if it's been stolen and been buried in consecrated ground, that disturbances at the farm, and also in the vicinity, had to make it to where the skull had to be returned. And whichever story that you choose to believe, it would appear that this skull belongs to a murder victim. Then we have Warbleton Prior Ruin. We do not. We're simple over here. It's too many syllables. Anyhow, this is in East Sussex. See, even that one. It's like Norfolk. A lot of things around here do not pronounce them the way that they're spelled because they'll be inaccurate. But East Sussex, this is also not open to the public. And the former priory, which I found out that priory is like a monastery, is now in ruins and is situated within the area covered by a modern farm. But hidden within its walls somewhere is not one screaming skull, but two. And one is supposed to have belonged to a prior who was murdered. The other skull belongs to his murderer. And this unusual or the usual mayhem is said to have followed any attempt of the removal from the priory. However, they said that there is another story concerning these skulls. Apparently, at some time before being bricked up, the skulls were placed in the branches of an apple tree for some reason. I guess they had to have some place to put them. And that while they were in the tree, a bluebird took a liking to one of the skulls and built its nest in it. They said the bird used the eye sockets as entrances to its rather unique nest box. And apparently the skull approved of it, and that one had remained silent. So, I don't know, maybe its mouth was filled with feathers. And then the last one from this article is Wardley Hall, and this is in Greater Manchester, and this one is also not open to the public. These are people's houses, I guess. I guess these people still live there. And it says that there is a skull at Wardley Hall is not disputed. The original owner of the skull is even known. However, whether or not it is a screaming skull, that is, does it actually scream, is another story. They said that the skull belonged to a Catholic priest who was Father Ambrose Barlow, who was hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1641 for his faith. That's a little overkill, isn't it, to have somebody hanged and then drawn and quartered? It says his head was then put on display in Lancaster Castle. The skull was taken to the hall by a Catholic sympathizer and hidden, not only to be rediscovered in the 18th century, or only to be rediscovered in the 18th century. It is now preserved in a specially built niche at the top of the hall's main staircase. That is the accepted history of the alleged screaming skull. Legend, however, expands upon known facts. It is said that a servant threw the relic into the moat, whereupon a terrible storm arose. The owner of the hall realized that the skull was angry at being removed, and so he had the moat drained. I didn't even know that you could drain a moat. And the skull was placed in the hallway where it is today, well out of reach of anyone else who may wish to get rid of it. And I don't know what it is that these people, just because they don't like skulls and they decide to take somebody else's skull and do something with it. No, if you see that, leave it alone. If you have relics like that, I'm not a fan of human remains at all. I mean, if it is, with science and stuff like that, that's understandable. Specimens are different. I understand this is a cultural thing. But unless you knew somebody, I would be very hard-pressed to allow any kind of human remains to stay in my home for very long. And maybe that's just me. If you've had encounters with the paranormal or supernatural, experiences with UFOs, aliens, screaming skulls, cryptids, what have you, if you have local, regional family myths and legends that you would like to share, send me an email at cupofcoffeewithscream@gmail.com, and the email address is always there in the description box. And you all have a beautiful, blessed day, and hopefully youngest kid will feel better to where he can enjoy a cup with us the next day. So we'll see you on the next cup. Bye.